Good day, class. Today, we are going to discuss your Module 3 here in your subject Ethics, which is entitled Freedom and Reason as Requirements of Morality. So in this module, let us now take a look about your freedom, which is part of the concept regarding these topics. So in here, of course, we believe that freedom is a concept that makes us do anything that we want, but of course, there are certain limitations for what we do, and that we protect moral principles regarding, especially when we are in a society, we do not have absolute freedom. Now, moving on, when we evaluate or judge someone's actions morally, like deciding if something is like right or wrong, we usually assume that people have the freedom to choose their actions. Well, this means that they can decide to do something differently if they want to. Let us say, for example, class, when we say stealing is wrong, we assume that people have the choice not to steal because they are free to make that decision. If they didn't have the ability to choose differently, it would be hard to say that they did something wrong because they wouldn't have had a choice in the manner. So class, moral appraisal means we assess people's actions that are based on the idea that they have the freedom to make choices and that they could have chosen to do something else, and that this assumption of freedom is fundamental to how we think about right and wrong in ethics. In your next slide, class, one of the things that you have seen in this slide is, of course, the picture of one of the greatest philosophers of the modern period, which is Immanuel Kant. So, Immanuel Kant, which has been put in the slide, had therefore provided this quote. So he stated, in order for this man's action to be morally wrong, it must have been within his control in the sense that it was within his power. So in this quote, class, Kant's view that freedom is a crucial concept in moral philosophy because it's tied to the idea of moral responsibility. Class, imagine you have a friend who borrowed your favorite book without asking and then returned it with pages torn, and of course, there are scribbles all over it or kaya may kusot-kusot. So, you might be upset with your friend for damaging your book, but according to Kant, he said that whether you can call your friend's action morally wrong depends on whether your friend had the freedom to make a different choice. So in here, if your friend borrowed the book under the threat or was forced to scribble in it, then they didn't really have a choice. In this case, it might still be wrong in some sense, but it wouldn't be a morally wrong action because they didn't have the freedom to do otherwise. However, if your friend had the choice to ask for permission or not damage the book but still chose to do so, Kant would say that their action is morally wrong because they had the freedom to make a different, more ethical choice. So Kant's idea of freedom helps us determine when we can truly hold someone morally accountable for their actions. Moving on towards your next slide, class, it states that moral rightness and wrongness apply only to free agents who control their actions and have it in their power at the time of their actions, either to act rightly or not. So in here, class, when we talk about whether something is morally right or wrong, we're usually talking about people who can make choices and control their actions. In other words, it applies to individuals who can decide to do the right thing or the wrong thing when they act. Let's say, for example, if we say lying is morally wrong, we're assuming that a person who tells a lie has the ability to choose whether to tell the truth or not. They had the power to act in a way that is truthful, but they choose to lie instead. So in here, in ethics, we typically judge actions as morally right or wrong based on the idea that people have the freedom and control to decide how they behave. If they didn't have the ability to make choices, it would be harder to say whether their actions are morally right or wrong because they wouldn't have had a say in that matter. Moving on towards your ethical arguments, it states in this slide that in moral philosophy, an argument is not simply about our beliefs or opinions. Instead, it is about the reasons underlying those beliefs and opinions. Class, in moral philosophy, when we talk about an argument, we are not just talking about what someone believes or thinks. We are actually talking about the reasons behind why they believe or think that way. So it's not enough to say, I believe this is right or wrong. Instead, we want to know why someone believes that. What are the reasons or explanations behind their beliefs and opinions? It's like asking, why do you think that's right or wrong? In moral philosophy, the focus is on understanding the discussion between these reasons because they help us better understand why people have certain moral beliefs. It's about digging deeper into the why behind what we think is right and wrong. Moving on to your next slide, which is still under your ethical argument, the first one states that the real value of discussing and debating ethical question is not to win the argument or to score points against the other person. And the second point is that ethical argument requires careful listening to, analysis of, and learning from the arguments that others make. So here, class, when we have discussions or debates about ethical questions, which of course are questions about what's right or wrong, the most important thing isn't trying to win or make the other person look wrong. The real value in these discussions is about something deeper. It's about sharing and understanding different viewpoints and ideas. It's about trying to learn and gain a better understanding of why people believe what they do. Instead of trying to score points or be the winner, it's more important to have a thoughtful and respectful conversation where everyone can share their thoughts and learn from each other. So in here, class, the main goal of discussing ethical questions is not to prove someone right or wrong, but to have meaningful exchange of ideas and hopefully arrive at a better understanding of what is morally right or wrong in a given situation. Moving on towards the concept of your rationalization, class, rationalization is a common human behavior and we often do it without even realizing it. It's a way our minds protect our self-image and avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about our motivations, or that you are sugarcoating the truth instead of telling your real motivation. In ethical debates, recognizing rationalization is important because it can cloud the real issues at hand. When people offer false or misleading reasons for their actions or beliefs, it can make it difficult to have an open and honest conversation about what is morally right or wrong. So for instance, class, if someone is arguing for a particular environmental policy and they claim their main reason is to protect the planet, but their true motivation is to gain favor with a certain group of voters, and that is rationalization. Because of course, there is again sugarcoating. This can lead to a distorted discussion because the real motives aren't being addressed. So in summary, class, rationalization is when people give justifications for their actions or beliefs that hide their true motivations. In ethical discussions, being aware of this behavior and striving for transparency in our reasoning can lead to more meaningful and productive conversations about what is right or wrong in a given situation. It allows us to move beyond arguments and work towards a deeper understanding of our beliefs and attitudes. Let us move on towards your types of reasoning. So class, our very first type of reasoning is your reasoning by analogy, which is a way of explaining something by comparing it to something else that's similar in certain ways, even though there are also differences. Now class, Imagine you're trying to make a point about whether non-human animals should have rights similar to humans. And to do this, you might draw an analogy between humans and animals. You could say that humans and animals are alike in some important respects because both are part of the animal kingdom. We share many biological and emotional characteristics with them. However, there are also differences between humans and animals, such as our higher cognitive abilities or mental abilities, which is your synonym, not opposite. So here, the key question is it whether the similarities between your humans and animals are strong enough to support the argument that non-human animals should have rights like humans do? So in other words, can we use the similarities to justify giving animals certain rights, such as the right to be treated with kindness and not subjected to unnecessary suffering? So in here, class, analogies can be helpful in ethical discussions like this one because they allow us to see connections between different situations. However, it is important to remember that not all analogies are equally strong. In a good analogy, the similarities should be more important and relevant than the differences. Now, class, let us move on towards your second ethical reasoning, which is your deductive reasoning. Class, deductive reasoning in ethics means using clear rules to decide what's right or wrong in specific situations. Think of it like having a rule that says stealing is bad. So if you're thinking about taking something that doesn't belong to you, deductive reasoning tells you that it's wrong because it falls under the rule that stealing is bad. It's like following a roadmap of rules to make good moral decisions, like knowing not to steal because stealing is against the rules of being a good person. So moving on towards your third type of your ethical reasoning, we have your inductive reasoning. So this reasoning involves providing evidences to support a hypothesis. So inductive reasoning is like gathering lots of clues to solve a mystery. For instance, when we talk about global warming and reducing carbon emissions, it's a bit like being detectives. So, we've collected a ton of evidence over time like rising temperatures, melting ice caps, and extreme weather elements. So, all this evidence points to one main idea: burning fossil fuels like gas and coal, which is causing the Earth to get warmer. So just like when you find lots of clues that all lead to the same suspect in a mystery, all the evidence here leads us to the idea that we should do something about carbon emissions. In other words, the more evidence we have, the more confident we become in our belief that we should take action to protect the environment. Lastly, let us take a look on your testing moral arguments. So in here, class, Wright had argued that there are three main considerations in testing a moral argument. So the first one is your factual accuracy. Class, your factual accuracy is about making sure that the information in an ethical discussion is true and correct. In other words, it's important that the facts are accurate when we're talking about what's right or wrong. Let's say, for example, let's say someone argues that donating money to charities working in Africa is a bad thing because they believe that 90% of the money actually goes to the rich people while 10% goes to the poor. If this claim is proven to be false and it turns out that 90% of the money is usually used to help the poor, then the person's moral argument loses its strength. So what this means is that when we're discussing ethics and what's right or wrong, we need to base our arguments on accurate facts. If the facts are incorrect, it can weaken our moral arguments even if they might make sense in theory. Therefore, it's important to ensure that the information we use in ethical discussions is as accurate as possible to have a meaningful and informed conversation about morality. Second, we have your consistency. Class, Your consistency in arguments means that if you say something that is morally wrong in one situation but morally okay in another similar situation, you need to have a good reason for the difference. Let's say, for example, let's say you argue that it's morally wrong to kill one person but morally acceptable to kill another person. To make this argument consistent, you'd need to show that there's a morally relevant difference between the two individuals, something that justifies treating them differently. So in context of debts, if you believe that the debts owed by poorer countries to international lenders should be cancelled for moral reasons, you should consider whether the same moral reasoning should apply to all poor individuals who owe money to banks. If you believe that only the country's debts should be cancelled and not individual debts, then you should be able to explain why there's a moral difference between these two situations. In essence, consistency in ethical arguments means treating similar situations in a similar way unless you can provide a valid moral reason for treating them differently. Otherwise, your arguments might be seen as inconsistent or unfair. Lastly, we have your goodwill. So, your goodwill class means when we talk about what's right or wrong, we should do it because we really want to do the right thing and help others, not just to win an argument. It's about having a kind and caring attitude in addition to making logical arguments. So think of it like this, class. Imagine you're discussing whether to help someone in need. Having goodwill means you genuinely want to help them because you care about their well-being, not just because you want to prove a point or look smart in the discussion. This can be hard because it involves not only thinking logically, but also feeling and caring about what's right. So in ethical discussions, having goodwill means being both thoughtful and kind-hearted.